So I'm very pleased with the timing of this because my story is going to be about Russia, and I have two Russians who are about to leave. So I needed someone here to prove that what I'm talking about is true. So in my second year of university, I went to visit my best friend, who was at the time living in Moscow in Russia, obviously. And so I went over to see her during Easter break, and I can tell you a few things about Moscow in March. One is it's cold. It's fucking cold. And I was told by everyone there that, oh, this is great, you're here in time for spring. It's like 2 degrees half the time in the few brief hours of sunlight that you received. So we're like, look, some of the ice is melting. It's spring. But for me, growing up in Hong Kong, this was cold. Another thing I can tell you is probably because of the cold, everybody stinks. I'm serious. People smell terrible. And I just arrived there in March. You have to think, I mean, it made a little bit of sense when you thought these guys have been through winter for maybe, 5 months at this point? And for your own personal reference, I did shower while I was in Russia. But every time you did, it took grit. Like, you look at yourself in the mirror, and you go, you can do this. This is hygiene. But every item of clothing is a trial. So you think, if I'd done 4 or 5 months of winter here, no. But would I be taking off my clothes? Would I be showering? Probably not. So it explains it, but it's still not very pleasant that most people around you smell pretty bad most of the time. Another thing is, once again, a huge sweeping generalization that only maybe applies to March, is that everyone is at least a little bit inebriated at pretty much all times. Once again, this is the long extended winter, perhaps long dark days of misery. Perhaps they're just trying to blot out the smell of other people. It makes sense. So if you've ever been to like a supermarket in the US and they have rows upon rows of breakfast cereal, which always amazes me that there's so much breakfast cereal. But in Russia, they have that with vodka. Seriously, I am totally serious. Like, check this out. So, as you can imagine, the remainder of my trip is a bit of a drunken blur. So that's really, I can't tell you a lot more about Russia. I can tell you they have wonderful blinis. Like the most beautiful street stall blinis with salmon roe, little orange bubbles of fishy goodness that burst in your mouth. And they make the smell and the drunkenness and the cold and everything worthwhile. They're truly amazing. So before I fly back to the UK for university, I decide that I want to have one more blini before I head to the airport. You can see the disaster coming, right? Set up. So I go and have my blini, and it's delicious, as you can imagine. While you're having your blini on these little street stalls, you have little tables and with little hooks right underneath. So I hang my handbag on the hook underneath. It's sort of hovering around my groin area, around there. And by the time I'm just finished with my glorious blini, my handbag is no longer present. So, as I mentioned, I'm on my way to the airport. So everything is in that handbag. That's my passport, that's my money, that's everything, except maybe I had my mobile phone in my pocket, which was handy. So it's rather a disaster. I'd like to also point out this disaster is exacerbated because it's been emphasized to me that if you do not have valid travel documents to say that you're entitled to be in Russia and you get spot checked by police, they will throw you in prison and ask you questions later. You can't say, but I was having a blini. And I was with an Asian friend of mine, the friend I was visiting, and she said, oh yeah, they spot check Asians all the time. So I was a little nervous at this point. I was thinking I'm going to have to spend a couple days hiding under a bed, like pretending, until I can get the embassy to give me a visa back. So while, this is all playing out in my mind, the dramatic consequences of this drama. And I do what any sensible and experienced traveler would do at this point. I burst into tears, and I call my mother. And so she gets on the phone, she's canceling my credit cards, she's talking to Svetlana at the British Embassy in Moscow. She's sorting stuff out, while I am crying to the heavens at my misfortune. And so I'm finding every reason to be angry and upset. I'm bringing up the stinky people. I'm bringing up the cold. I'm pretty much all around angry. But I'm also particularly angry at suddenly this delicious blini that distracted me. And I'm angry at my obviously oblivious groin area that didn't notice a handbag being stolen from in front of it. So I'm just all around angry, but other people are being very productive. So my best friend, while I'm doing these curses to the heavens, she's using her Russian skills and her Hong Kong bargaining skills to negotiate with the police. And she's a poor, starving student the same way I am at this point, but she scrapes together what little money she has, and she gives it to the police to help them with the investigation. You know, in the classic Russian style of assisting with the investigation. And lo and behold, within 5 minutes, here comes my handbag out of the back office of the police department. So before you all heave a sigh of relief in sympathy for me, I'd like you to stop and think about what that implies. The fact is so obvious that these criminals are working in league with the police. They probably split the money in your purse, they split the bribe money, and everyone walks away happy except me. Well, actually, at the end of the day, the strange thing is that you're a little grateful to the fact that it's a vicious cycle of corruption. Because if it was an independently working criminal, my bag would be in a gutter somewhere and the police wouldn't find it with a little bit of a bribe, right? So, I mean, you end up being almost grateful to the people that made you suffer. It's a really masochistic situation. So, in the end, I'm like, great, here's my handbag, the passport's still in my hidden pocket, fine, there's no cash, my friend gives me whatever she can spare after her bribe. I probably made her eat baked beans for a month, but she was just lovely about it. And what I need then, I'm a few hours away from getting on this plane, I'm like, you know, Tanvir story similar, like, all right, what I need is a taxi, and I need it fast. And was there a taxi? Anyone? Anyone? No. No, there's no taxi. So my friend reaches out her hand, like as though there's a taxi coming. I'm like, where? Do you see one? Where is it? And she goes, Emma, this is Russia. Every car is a taxi. I was like, all right. This is what I know. Along comes this car, and a guy sort of leans over. He's not a taxi driver. No, he's not a taxi driver. He's just a guy who has some time on his hands, wants to make a bit of cash, like, where are you going? All right. So they negotiate a price, and he clears the fast food off the back seat, makes a little space for me. I get in this taxi, sort of like, okay, I'm almost there. Get in this cab, wave gratefully to my friend, and drive off into nowhere. No battery on my phone. No money, except for exactly the amount I've been sort of, agreed to pay this guy. And I have no idea where I'm going. He's not a taxi driver. No one's licensed. I have no idea where I'm headed. And I'm looking for this symbol. I'm looking for the picture of an airplane. And I can't see it. And we keep going. And I'm like, this is it. I am going to be taken to a forest, raped and murdered. And suddenly losing my wallet, suddenly going to a Russian prison doesn't seem that bad anymore. You know, and you think, really, I got into this guy's car. Like, I was in such a vulnerable situation. But the glimmer of light in the form of that little airplane sign did eventually show up. He was taking me to the right place. I arrive at the airport and I leave sort of with a semi-grateful hatred, like you were maybe gonna rape me. Poor guy, you probably had no bad intentions whatsoever, but I had this whole visual, like the entire time, my heart pounded, and I was terrified. So I was one of those people who jumps in front of the queue in movies. I'm not a queue jumper. So it was like excuse me, I have a flight to catch. I'd had this very dramatic morning. I was feeling quite high intensity. And so I managed just about, last person on the plane. You can see people glaring at me like, oh, what an irresponsible traveler. And I finally sit down on this Alitalia flight back to London, and sort of the roller coaster of the emotions of the day have sort of come and hit me. And so what I do is I take out the vomit bag. I don't vomit. It's not that kind of a roller coaster. Emotional roller coaster. Take a vomit bag and I borrow a pen from the air hostess and I start writing a letter to my mother. The type of letter you would write to your mother if a few minutes before you thought you might die. I'm getting a little teary. So I'm not going to tell you the content of the letter because it's not that type of a storytelling evening. But needless to say, my mother keeps the letter that I wrote on that vomit bag in her handbag at all times. Yeah, stop it. And I can tell you that the ordeal that it was, probably mainly in my head, like it doesn't help that I'm truly paranoid and have obviously death fantasies. But the whole experience really, I mean, it was a little scary. It had no long-lasting negative consequences, and it made me stop and appreciate the wonderful friends I had that were willing to spend all their money on bribes. My family and friends across the world that were sort of helping to get me out of dire situations when I put myself into them by eating too many blinis. And it just made you stop and appreciate how lucky you were. So in the end, I think I ended up pretty good.